Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining us today. So before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. As you might have noticed, walking into this virtual room, this session is going to be recorded and the replay will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. We are going to use Slido for the questions. You can connect using the code DisinfoLab. And just to get started and get us all acquainted with this tool, which will be used for the Q&A, please let us know where you are joining us from today and which sector you represent. In the meanwhile, for those of you who don't know us, just a few information. So the DisinfoLab is an independent NGO focused on researching and tackling disinformation campaigns targeting the EU, its member states and core values, and advocating for policy improvements in the field. And we are thrilled today to be pairing with She Persisted, which is a global initiative that works to end gender disinformation and abuse against women in public life through research, support for women leaders, and advocacy for safer online spaces. And with us today, we have Lucina di Meco, who is the co-founder of She Persisted. She's a women's rights advocate and author, and Lucina has been recognized by Apolitical as one of the 100 most influential people in gender policy. And her work has been featured on many different outlets, from the New York Times to the BBC, Washington Post, Politico, etc. And I also welcome with us Anna Fejős, who is a sociologist at the Institute for Sociology, Center for Social Studies, and research affiliate at the Democracy Institute of the Central European University in Budapest. Anna's research interests include the study of gender and ethnic racial inequalities, social inclusion and exclusion, and equality policies concerning vulnerable social groups. She has co-edited a book on the topic and extensively published on this topic. As for myself, I am Giovanna Sessa. I am senior researcher and research coordinator at the DisinfoLab, and among other things, I also work on gender-based disinformation. So I am especially happy to welcome you today to this session. And without further ado, I'm leaving the floor to Lucina to introduce us this very interesting report she produced. Lucina, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maria Giovanna. I'm thrilled to be here with you today, talking about my latest research on gender disinformation around the globe, and with a particular focus on 5 countries. And thrilled to be with you and Anna today too, in particular, because we've been such key participants to this research as interviewees and supporters and really mentors in this study. So research is really one of the 3 core pillars that She Persisted works on. We do analysis of gender disinformation in a number of countries around the world, trying to look at countries that have been overlooked or where the research isn't that deep yet. We also support women leaders to increase their digital resilience based off some of the learnings from the research too. And ultimately, the goal is to advocate and get to really better and safer digital platform standards. And so we'll get to this part a little bit in the solutions. That is also something that we address in our research. First of all, when we talk about gender disinformation, I want to share a little bit about our definition. And we have been thrilled to have been one of the organizations that really started trying to come up with a working definition and taxonomy around this problem, and a problem that has increasingly been recognized by many different actors, governments, and including Maria Ressa in her Nobel Prize speech acceptance as really a threat, a very important threat to democracy and to women and girls all over the world. So we define gender disinformation as the spread of deceptive or inaccurate information and images, and the image part is really core. We'll be seeing it very soon in some of the examples, against women political leaders, journalists, or female public figures, following storylines that often draw on misogyny as well as gender stereotypes. So the gender part here is both in the target of the disinformation as well as in the nature of the disinformation, disinformation being really along storylines that wouldn't work quite in the same way for men, again, because they are really steeped in misogyny. So the Italy and Hungary case studies are part of a larger series that we have called Monetizing Misogyny, because it particularly looks at the role that social platforms have and digital platforms have in really incentivizing the share of this harmful content and in ultimately monetizing out of it. So the incentive system is such that it only makes sense for malign actors to actually use digital platforms as a way to propagate misinformation, disinformation, and harmful content and hate content. The research findings on the attack lines we have found against women leaders are really based off certain existing biases around distrust of women leaders in general and their leadership capabilities. We have sexualized attacks and character attacks. And again, we'll get in the examples to see how this looks like. So on the main actors and really super spreaders, as we call them often, of gender disinformation, we see strongman political leaders, illiberal actors, often that are supporting autocrats or illiberal movements in many contexts, the manosphere, and average people that are often pulled into that mix, following different storylines that can go from concerns around certain movement or certain pieces of legislation or COVID vaccines, and then they get pulled into really a rabbit hole where they find some of the most horrific disinformation and hate content. The goals and impact of gender disinformation go actually beyond the chilling effect to the women themselves who are attacked, and really get to eroding democratic institutions and human rights. Why? Because we have found that gender disinformation has been used as a very successful tool, unfortunately, to eliminate women who are leading voices in the opposition to strongman political leaders, pushing those women out of politics, also as a way to silence again their platforms, their calls for better governance, their calls for certain pieces of legislation that, for example, want to increase rights for minorities. And at times we have seen also gender disinformation being used to exercise undue influence in foreign elections. And we know that Russia has been a particularly active actor in this field. Let's have now a deep dive on Italy and Hungary. So those were the patterns overall we have found in all the countries that we have investigated. But there are specificities to those two case studies that have been grounded on both personal interviews, desk research, and social media monitoring, quantitative analysis with a couple of different methodologies. And you find everything on the case studies. We talk better about the people that we have talked to and how we have done it. So why did we pick those two countries? We thought that those two countries were both really interesting in different ways and really represented together a very interesting full pictures. Italy, of course, is one of the founding members of the European Union, has long had an important geopolitical role within the region, in many ways as a battleground for competing political ideologies and visions, starting with the Cold War. And today, those competing political ideologies and visions very often go around the trends around women's rights and minority, the gender equality movement, the treatment of immigrants, and so on. So what we see happening in Italy is often a warning sign for a number of trends we see happening in a number of different countries in the region. Hungary, as a door to the European Union, is equally very, very interesting, including for what has been happening in the last decade or so, where we have seen an increased relevance of the trends happening in Hungary, really as paving the way for, in some ways, religious and social conservative movements in Europe and even around the world, with a very strong connection between Orban and former President Trump, for example. And therefore, again, what is happening in Hungary and the type of trends we see there are relevant even beyond this country. The main takeaways and the main things that have been at play in our vision and in our analysis have some common trends, both in Hungary and in Italy. We see, for example, gender disinformation and fear-mongering around gender equality, and particular the gender equality movement in schools, being used really as a symbolic glue. And so the stories, the fake narratives around the gender equality movement, comprehensive sexuality education in schools, is really prevalent, and in some occasions has been actually very successful in undermining progress in gender equality through education. Some of the most vicious gender disinformation and hate campaigns in both countries actually are being deployed against women leaders who are outspoken on women's rights, gender issues, sexual and reproductive health, LGBT, refugees, and in the case of Hungary, also those opposing the government, and in particular, those that have different institutional roles, again, trying to oppose the government. So we see a fair amount of similarities. Again, there is also various movements that are demanding a return in some ways to Christian values and traditional values, and therefore this really playing an important role. In Italy, traditional media is guilty of replicating much of the disinformation very often deployed against women leaders. In Hungary, we see social media sadly representing really one more element of an almost perfect propaganda machine, with a lot of the accounts that are present and most active on social media actually belonging to sources affiliated to the government and spreading the same type of disinformation. Here are some of the examples that we look at deeper in our report. An analysis, for example, Timea Szabo has been one of the leaders whose attacks we have analyzed, and she has been really framed as a traitor of the countries in some ways, international trained agent, someone who would be destabilizing the country. And of course, in the case of Hungary, the conspiracy theory around affiliation of anyone who opposes the government with the Soros network, so-called, is actually very, very strong. Agnes Kunkami, and apologies for butchering the name, Anna. We have seen Agnes, a Hungarian member of parliament, being attacked viciously with all kinds of fake stories around the fact that she would have not had COVID, even though she said that she did, and she indeed was hospitalized for COVID. We also saw, interestingly, fake stories where she was shown wearing a headscarf and promising Arabic lessons for children, again, as a way of fear-mongering about the immigrants taking over in Hungary and women politicians being traitors of those traditional values and in some ways of a certain monoculturalism. Vicious gender disinformation campaigns, attacks, hate, abuse have also been used again, and doxing have also been used against various youth activists. And again, the fake stories then are followed by incredible levels of vitriol, hate, abuse, and threats. In Italy, we see some of the similar trends. For example, Monica Cirinà, member of parliament, has been outspoken supporter of LGBT rights. She was targeted with a fake campaign of disinformation, claiming that she would be inviting Italian couples to fly to the USA to buy children in the context of the conversation on surrogacy, and would also be making the teaching of masturbation compulsory in Italian schools. Again, those might seem like outlandish, absurd attacks and stories. However, they are actually quite powerful and undermine not only those women leaders, but very often also the bills that they are presenting and standing for. Laura Boldrini probably has been one of the most attacked women political leaders in Italy. She is a member of the parliament, former Speaker of the House. Among the attacks against her were also images where, you know, those that unfortunately had the displeasure of watching Italian TV in the 80s, they know that there was a fair amount of scantily dressed women in all kinds of TV shows. A picture at some point circulated online claiming Lara Boldrini was one of them. She wasn't. The resemblance with the original dancer was actually also quite vague, but still this was enough for this story to go on, and is still unfortunately alive on social media, claiming again that Boldrini isn't as serious because she would have been, you know, a scantily dressed dancer in a TV show. And talking about gender disinformation around the issue of education, of course, Valeria Fedeli, former Minister of Education, has been one of the most attacked with all kinds of fake stories that try to paint her as evil, as well as stupid, unprepared, and so on and so forth. We will get hopefully to the solutions a little bit more in our conversation, but I think that the main point I want to make here is that we need to hold the platforms accountable for their role in the spread of this type of disinformation and hate, because this type of hate isn't truly happening by chance. As we say, it's happening by design because of algorithmic preferences that reward this type of content. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Lucina. I will leave the floor now to Anna to tell us a little bit more about the Hungarian case study. Anna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I am happy to be here, and I'm very honored to have the chance to participate in this project a little bit and contributing to this discussion. I was thinking I'm gonna say a few words. I'm gonna pick up where Lucina left off, telling about the Hungarian case a little bit, and I highlight a couple of points which I think are important in my opinion. First of all, I think it was very good that you contextualized the research in the Hungarian case in the context of de-democratization, because it is the media and the government control over the media is really one of the key aspects of how you can see the democratic backlash in Hungary taking over. And it is not just any random thing happening. It's very, very conscious, and it has been happening for a long time, gradually taking over the media, both the traditional and the online media. And I just want to read out a quote, which was said just lately, a few weeks ago, by the Prime Minister political director, who said on an international conference on media and the future of publishing that media is a strategic sector and a matter of sovereignty, because whoever controls the media of a country controls the mindset of that country, and through that, the country itself. So this is what the government thinks about media, and we have seen what kind of images come out. Now, what I think is an important thing is really to focus a little bit on the actors, because when we say pro-government social media, online media attacks, then it's not always the very same actor that we are talking about. So if we look at politicians' social media account, for instance, or the political parties' account, then we find a somewhat different kind of speech than what we find in pro-governmental media outlets and in the so-called influencer circle. Well, when I say political influencers, then you need to understand it in a way that these are people who are very, very closely tied to the government, so they are not like bottom-up influencers. But so there is a certain division of work among these actors. And yeah, you can see already a beautiful image by one of these public figures who is very active on gender disinformation in general and gender issues in particular. But so when you look at the account of politicians, then they usually talk in abstract terms. They attack more general ideas. We like to call them in the scientific literature, they refer to it as anti-genderism. So gender as such, gender equality as such, and women's rights in very, very broad and general terms. There are phases of these Soros agents, there are phases of Brussels bureaucrats, but not particular women. Or very rarely particular politicians or any other women. But when you look at the media, the government-controlled media, and some of these influencers, then you find very, very personalized attacks. And these are all resembling what Lucina told about these leadership biases on how the women are depicted. And this is a very good example that I brought for you, because here you can also see how differently the women connected to the Fidesz party and the women connected to the opposition are being treated. So sometimes they are put next to each other. And here on the first line, you can see the women from the opposition. They are all portrayed as very angry, very emotional, very hysteric. Of course, they are also accused to be dumb, unqualified, and untrustworthy, and in general, they are usually called as those who don't support the interests of the country. Whereas the conservative women politicians are portrayed in as natural beauties, or if not beauties, but like very, very human beings who are smart, who are able to fulfill this ideal woman's role also when it comes to politics. And these playing with the emotions is a very, very often used tool, and to depict these women politicians as historic and too emotional to take part. This is something that happens very often. Now, one more thing that I want to emphasize here is also how far these attacks can go, because when you see a single post of about any of these pictures on the above line picked out and attacking post next to it, then you usually also get comments and commentators which naturalize this kind of attacks, and they go as far as that they sometimes propose to really expel the rights of these women, that these women should no longer be the citizens of the country, or they should be kicked out of parliament. So practically, this is something that happens quite often, that even the right to speak is questioned. And one more thought that I would like to mention here is that while we are speaking most of the times about politicians and women politicians as the main main targets of attack in Hungary, you need to know that these kind of targets can happen to any woman who has an opinion, who stands out for a cause to defend rights and to speak out on any matter connected to democracy. Even professional women who speak out for instance, teachers. This is now a big, there has been a big protest line now for the situation of the education and teachers in particular. And these women also become very often the target of this kind of gender disinformation. And the attacks are very, very often portrayed in a way that defend that try to argue for the defense of children and children's right, and claim that these women are not beneficial for children, and also the ideas that they promote are not beneficial for children. This is a way that we found in my research with my colleagues, as a kind of use of the human rights language, which is about defense and which is about the right of the child. And this is kind of twisted and turned upside down when it comes to attacking their political opponent. And yes, as Lucina showed us, there are women as or even girls as young as high schoolers who become these targets. So then you can see, and I would like to leave this short presentation with this idea, that there is a very, very hard arguing for the rights of children and a healthy way of growing out for children. But if you look at what kind of texts are receiving those young girls or young women who stand up and say anything about education, about women's rights, about any public issue, then you can wonder what kind of child protection that is. For instance, in the latest attack, protester speaker was called a dirty little whore. So this, I think, is about Hungary for now. I'm open for questions later.
Thank you, Anna. Indeed, it's concerning to realize that there are so many similarities between Hungary and Italy, on which I would like to say a few words. So definitely one of the many things that I have appreciated in the report concerning Italy is the contextualization, which really got me thinking. It is mentioned that things really changed in Italy since what we called the beginning of the Second Republic in the 90s and the rise of Silvio Berlusconi, which unfortunately I think that everyone in the audience knows, but let's say that he might be considered our Donald Trump before Donald Trump. So the way in which the media and the way in which the media portrayed women really permeated widely our society. And indeed, as mentioned also by Lucina, the media is a big actor in propagating and amplifying gender-based disinformation in the country to this day. And when I was asked to wear the hat, not just of moderator of this webinar, but also of discussant, I thought that I wanted to keep things very simple and very short. And I wanted to find an evocative image to to help out my presentation. And well, I found it a couple of weeks ago, following the election of a new secretary of the center-left Democratic Party in Italy. You see on the left, there is Italy Hungary, who won these primary elections, especially thanks to the support of sympathizers, as these elections of the Democratic Party were not just limited to traditional members, but also to sympathizers and subscribers. Basically, everyone could participate, and this really turned around the results, because the polls revealed that Italy Hungary was particularly voted by non-members of the party. La Repubblica, which is a very relevant newspaper in Italy, commented this victory with this op-ed. So as you can see, we have the two profiles, literally, of two very powerful female politicians in Italy right now. On the left, we have Italy Hungary, and on the right, we have our Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. And the title reads, Ellie and Giorgia. So you see that they are not entitled to their titles, or not even to their surname. A duel on femininity. So these women stand for completely opposite topics in what is really concerning time for the discussion of civil rights and democracy. And one of the most relevant newspapers in the country trivializes this debate by calling it a duel, and limiting this whole discussion on femininity, not even feminism, just femininity. So one thing is definitely true, which the report mentions, and that often commentators of online haters and attackers of gender-based disinformation are too, let's say, ignorant or superficial to actually attack the topics that these female leaders defend, but they just focus on the appearances. And this is definitely true. As you can imagine, Italy Hungary has been attacked for not filling stereotypical criteria of gender roles and beauty, for occupying a previously all-male space, as she's also the first woman to be secretary of such a relevant party in the country, and as well as Giorgia Meloni, with silly comments about whether she changed her hairstyle or gained weight since she became prime minister. But of course, it's not just as naive and simple as that. Because these women get very much attacked for the topics that they defend and the positions that they stand for. And in this case, Italy Hungary has it all, let's say. She has been the target in the last weeks of a huge gender-based disinformation campaign, which is focused on misogyny, on her being a woman who occupies a previously held male space, that rejects gender stereotypes. A young woman, she's in her 30s, which is considered very much young for our middle-aged political class. She was attacked with homophobic attacks because she is openly bisexual, as well as anti-Semitism, as she comes from a Jewish background. One of the things that I did to prepare for this conversation, and just probably because, I don't know, I like to do this to myself for some reason, was to check out the websites and channels of pro-life movements, or we should call them what they really are, that is to say, anti-choice movements. And Italy Hungary has, needless to say, soon become the perfect embodiment of everything that they reject, calling out her positions on abortion, euthanasia, on the legalization of light drugs, on being part of the LGBTQ+ community, on having progressive positions around migration. And of course, this is all beautifully or awfully, up to you to decide, packed up in terms of, as a defender of the so-called gender ideology, the gender theory that also Anna mentioned, so this idea that children would be indoctrinated and forcefully converted to homosexuality and other absolute nonsense. And on the other hand, we have Giorgia Meloni, who is the cover person for the far right, a far right that recognizes women's rights only as mothers, as the report rightfully says. And that is the perfect example of what I consider to be gender washing. So the idea that having a woman in a position of power, in this case, at the top of her party, Brothers of Italy, but also at the top of a country, Italy, being the first female prime minister, should be enough for the gender equality fight. And of course, this is also used as a sort of cover to promote even more conservative and oppressive legislation. So for those that say that these are only probably much ado about nothing and that despite the various positions, nothing much changes, well, I strongly disagree. And to support this, I would like to say what has happened in Italy over the past week. So the Italian government, in the form of a letter sent from the Interior Ministry to the mayor of Milan, of my city, Beppe Sala. So the basically Italian government told the Milan City Council that they should stop registering children that are the children of same-sex parents of same-sex couples, and that they were and children that were part of surrogate birth. And this is, of course, a huge deal because it really shows how this environment of hate, of gender-based attacks, which is not simply against women, but also beyond a binary conception of gender and a broader conception of gender affecting the LGBTQ+ community, it's bringing real-life consequences offline, in real life, in everyday life. And of course, let me point out the sad irony of a political alignment which has always disregarded the civil rights battles, calling them not a priority, which as one of the first actions that they carry out while in government is this, which ultimately affects children. So I will stop right here saying that we always say that gender-based information's ultimate goal is to silence the target, which is true. Another goal that we should particularly keep in mind, and that Lucina brilliantly mentioned during her presentation, is that the goal is also to influence legislators and to pass more restrictive legislation, which is happening and which ultimately is an undeniable attack on democracy. And I will stop right here. Sorry to stop on such a gloomy note, but I think that it's absolutely necessary to call things by their name. And we are now very happy to answer questions. I see that there are already a few on our slido.com page. May I remind you that you can participate using the hashtag DisinfoLab. The first question is, so you talk about women who are journalists, politicians, and public figures, but what about other women? Are they included in the scope of this and other studies? I will leave the floor to either Lucina and Anna. I noticed that Anna did mention the attack also on regular women, let's say, in her presentation, but either one of you, please take over this question.
Yeah, thank you, Maria Giovanna, and I let Anna talk to the broader, side of things. When it comes to this study in particular, as well as the work of She Persisted, we focus on, in general, women political leaders, women political activists, in this respect, also women's rights defenders, in particular, when it comes to women's rights, because this is just part of our strategy, together with the support of women leaders and the other advocating for stronger digital platform standards. There are amazing studies that I have seen in general looking at the impact of gender disinformation on young women. For example, in general, girls in particular. That's a study that came out, I think, a couple of years ago from Plan International. There are various organizations, and one in particular which does fantastic work around gender disinformation, online abuse against women journalists. It's the International Journalists Federation, with amazing reporting around Maria Ressa and very many other women journalists. So our angle, and what this study in particular is looking at, really revolves around women political leaders, but there are others that I know also deep dive into the impact of gender disinformation on, a broader set of the population.
Thank you. Let's move on to another question, which is very important, and I would like to have a more convincing answer. How do we counter such false narratives without amplifying them? What is the absolute first thing social media platforms should do to counter disinformation?
Again, on our side, we have worked in a coalition with other organizations on developing, on working with the media on what we have called Media Fairness Guide. You find it on the website of the American NGO Ultraviolet. And so it is the idea that it is possible for traditional media, for example, to report on gendered and racialized disinformation without replicating it. When it comes to the women leaders themselves, we have a number of recommendations in our Digital Resilience Toolkit on how they can best respond to some of the narratives and some of the attacks without amplifying them, and in some cases recovering their credibility. When it comes to the absolute first things that social media platforms should be doing, I think we can fairly say, after now many decades, that self-regulation has not worked. So the truth is that unless there are stronger regulations or platform standards, as we like to call them in the US, where the word regulation sounds very scary, we are not going to get out of this issue just by simply asking social media platforms to do more. They are perfectly aware, as we have found from the reports of whistleblower after whistleblower, they are perfectly aware what they could be doing to overcome this issue or to mitigating it. Each and every time they're choosing not to do it whenever this gets in conflict with their monetization goals and their economic incentives. And therefore, I think here, when we think about what we should be doing, it is really about working with regulators to make sure that we have stronger platform standards that can guarantee everyone can enjoy safer and better digital environments.
Thank you, Lucina. On this note, may I echo that as the DisinfoLab focuses also on policy work, we have hope in the Digital Services Act within the European, let's say, space. And although it does not explicitly mention gender-based disinformation, and it is focused mainly on, or exclusively, on illegal content, which of course is not always the case of gender-based disinformation or disinformation in general. There are tools, for instance, that might help, and for instance, the internal complaint handling system that has been foreseen, which allows users to appeal not over content moderation in terms of over moderation, so takedowns, but also under moderation, so platform inaction. The possibility to have an out-of-court dispute settlement by independent bodies, which makes it a bit more possible to tackle the so-called lawful but awful content, and also, for instance, the possibility for victims to be represented by third-party organizations, so they wouldn't have to relieve their trauma to have their rights respected. And so there are ways that we can use positively existing legislation to counter gender-based disinformation. And I believe that also in your report, one thing that I especially agree with is the idea that we should treat gender-based disinformation as an early warning system, because it is a security problem indeed. So and of course, we DisinfoLab and She Persisted wrote a few recommendations together around the Commission Directive in Countering Gender Violence, where we also advocate for the, well, ideally, in a perfect world, the recognition of gender-based disinformation as a violation of the terms of conditions and of platforms, in a more realistic way for soft measures such as training and fact-checking. Another question, why exactly are algorithms, platforms by design amplifying gender-based disinformation? I don't know if Lucina wants to answer this briefly, or Anna.
I can respond to that. So what we have heard very clearly from various sources, including whistleblowers, and most of them are women that courageously came out and shared some of the inner workings of those platforms. We have seen that really their business model is based on engagement. And there is study after study that shows that the type of content that enhances most engagement is content that is outrageous, have people get angry and therefore act out of that anger, content that has images, very often some shocking image or disgusting image, or again, an image that's meant to enhance hate or a strong reaction. And so it's really that those platforms are designed to reward that content, because that's the content that generates most engagement, and therefore through ad system, that's the content that generates more money for the platforms. We have known also, again, from the work of whistleblowers, that the companies often have developed risk assessments to figure out the potential harms of their products, and have decided to overlook those harms, even when they knew they could be existing, whenever those were in contrast with their bottom line. Ultimately, over and over again, we find that, for example, when it comes to also content moderation, anywhere outside of the US, or where there isn't going to be a PR crisis for those companies, there is very little money being spent on content moderation. Sometimes there isn't anyone that speaks the language in an entire country using social media to propagate all kinds of fake information. And so there is that element. There is also the element in some of the further case studies that we will look at. We will be releasing, for example, the India case study in April. And there in India, we see that oftentimes it seems that platforms have really turned a blind eye whenever the people spreading disinformation and hate were very close to the government, when instead they have put down posts from human rights activists and women's rights activists. And so there is a complicity that by now is quite clear, both in the not sharing of information and from any information that we find through those different sources. We have very strong reasons to believe that the platform's design is really a core essential part of this problem.
May I add something here? Just that be aware that the Hungarian government or the Fidesz party put enormous amount of money to promote their posts and the posts of their influencers. So if you pay well to Facebook, your content will be all over. And a problem with this, not only that who has the money, right? Fidesz party has the money and the opposition does not have the money, but also that you don't always know if you see an influencer or just an account spreading some type of information, whether it's connected to the government or not. And of course, with little research, you usually find out, but it's not directly there. So there is a lot of money put into to promote. They refuse, they reject completely that they would have anything to do with these influencers, but independent journalists have already found out that they do have, and already some of these faces were known from pro-government media before they became influencers. So sometimes it's just that you put a lot of money in it, and your content is all over.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. I think that this is very important. And also one more thing that we have seen is that there has been very little effort to actually curb down inauthentic actors from spreading content. So when it comes to gender disinformation, we see very often a very significant coordination with a fake story being spread in the very same second by thousands of accounts, each one sending it out as if it was their own personal story, but in fact, it's just a copy and paste. And many of those accounts are in fact inauthentic, which violates the terms of service of most of those companies. And yet there has been very little effort being put in curbing this down. So again, when we think about what can platforms do, they can do a lot. They could just very simply respect their own terms of service and the kind of promises that they make to users when they sign on their products, and however they decide not to do it over and over again. And on this, I also want to say, when you ask, for example, Twitter about these type of things, what they will tell you is that they actually don't know anything about who their users are, because their system is not such where they check even as something as simple as gender identity. Well, that's not exactly what they are telling, their advertisers. They're telling their advertisers they know exactly who their users are, what they like, and therefore the type of content that's going to be most popular. And they are right. So they cannot have it both ways. There is a set of people that they are lying to, and I believe they are lying to most of us.
Thank you, Lucina and Anna. Indeed, two very relevant points, both regarding the fact that the impossibility to perform attribution should not stop platforms from acting, and the fact that there is so much attention by platforms on coordinating inauthentic behavior, but then they don't tackle it correctly. So I would take quickly the last probably two questions that we see on top of the screen with the most votes. So which big tech social media platforms are the worst for spreading this misinformation, not taking them down? I don't necessarily have an exhaustive answer in this. I have to say that I find very concerning how different forms of gender-based information spreads on different social media. And for instance, one of the platforms that I really need to wrap my head around, and probably there's a little bit of a generational gap kicking in, is TikTok. And I see more and more content that is very concerning, spreading gender-based disinformation, but also advocating for what are labeled as sort of alternative forms of feminism, but are actually anti-gender positions, as the celebration of the so-called trad wives, so the choice for women not to work and become dependent financially on their partner, which is framed often by far-right influencers as a way to push their anti-gender ideas, and this, I think this is very, very concerning. And other than that, I also believe that different social media have different forms of attack, as they also have a different audience, but I find them all equally worrisome. I don't know if Lucina or Anna have a little bit more insight on this.
I think it depends on the countries, and in many countries around the world, Meta or Facebook is by large the biggest actor. Twitter is still a relatively small one with compared to Facebook in very many countries around the world. So I think with that type of profit and size also comes a greater responsibility and culpability.
I would like to emphasize that so far we talked about platforms which have an aim to moderate content in some ways, or they have a goal to take down hatred. But there are platforms, like not so mainstream platforms, which don't have such a goal. So those platforms are even more concerning, because they say that this is a platform for free speech, so we don't do anything. Now here you can say whatever, and you can finally be free of any content moderation. So I don't know how popular these sites will become. Maybe they will not become as mainstream, but maybe they will get enough people signing up and spreading messages. We have seen in our research in several European countries that these alternative platforms are also gaining ground. So there are some of these self-declared free speech actors moving there.
Definitely, it's a whole awful ecosystem. Thank you. So the algorithms platform by design questions, I believe, was already answered. Let's maybe wrap things up with oh, okay, a new question appeared. So very briefly, how is gender disinformation monetized online? Who are the firms, ultimate buyers that are funding this content? Are platforms profiting? I think that attribution is always tricky when it comes to these things. Maybe Lucina or Anna can say a few words on this.
I think, through the advertiser system, basically advertisers are paying companies to put their content, and then their content gets placed in around certain posts. Most often, actually, the advertisers don't know where the content is going to be placed. There are efforts to show that. I think also as an advocacy tool from organizations and initiatives like the Global Disinformation Index, I believe it's called, which is actually very interesting, because again, oftentimes those advertisers don't really want their content near some homophobic or hate-filled information, and therefore there is an effort there in trying to get those advertisers to come on board in this fight. So the profiting is coming from the platforms.
Thank you. I believe that this was the last question, as we are running out of time. I would like to thank Lucina and Anna for this very interesting discussion, and our participants who attended this webinar on the topic, may I please ask you to rate the webinar through Slido. Your feedback is always important to us. I remind you also, as I said earlier, that you will be able to replay the webinar on our YouTube channel, which will be available soon, if not even tomorrow. I take also this occasion to remind you that our next webinar will be on April 6th with my dear colleague Nicolas Henin. And probably also our policy coordinator Rita Yunushaite about foreign information and manipulation and interference. And if you want to stay tuned for this sort of updates, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you so much again, everyone, for attending. It was lovely to have this time with you, and we hope to keep in touch with you all soon. Lucina, Anna, thank you again. Goodbye. Have a good afternoon.